I think I introduced them as the power couple of the libertarian world, and I quite like how that sounds, so sticking to that. So without further ado, I present to you from Free the People, Terry and Matt Kibbe.
Terry, do you have an addendum to the power couple thing?
Yes, because I'm usually referred to as the better half of the power couple. Sorry, we're going to still play
Guys,
with this sound. I think that's better.
You're kind of going to see potentially the dysfunction of a otherwise solid marriage this afternoon. Because, my wife, she's an engineer. She likes structure, she likes order, she likes PowerPoint, and sometimes I just like to get up here and think out loud and abuse you guys with stream of consciousness.
Yeah, that doesn't always work out. I've seen it.
So it's some combination of order and chaos. We call it beautiful chaos. And she did put up with me, I guess that was last year in Prague. I somehow managed to get a 5-minute Frank Zappa guitar solo into a speech. That's how much she loves me.
Or tolerates you?
So this event is very special to us. As was mentioned, we've been to every one of these, starting in Batumi, Georgia. Were you in Batumi? Anyone?
We are.
And what about last year? Who was here? Okay. So we're going to try to do something a little bit different, but we also want to remind people the frame that some of the lectures we talked about in the past. And Terry, how did you get into Ayn Rand?
You gave me a copy of Atlas Shrugged for our first Christmas together.
And was that romantic to you?
Well, maybe.
I'm arguing that it worked.
It did work. He had tried it with other girls. It didn't work so well with them.
So what about that book is it really inspires you and has helped you as you live your life?
Well, Dagny, obviously. I mean, as Matt mentioned, I'm an engineer, so I really relate to her and how she approaches life and doesn't put up with stuff.
Yeah, my wife is a tough mama, and you should hear how she talks to me. It's unbelievable. But and I was turned on, not first Atlas Shrugged, but I discovered The Fountainhead when I was a very young guy, reading the liner notes on a Rush album. Any Rush fans? Woo! Yeah, we got one. Guys, you got to listen to Rush. It's going to change your life. And I eventually found The Fountainhead, and Terry could identify with the engineer and the logic and the process of the way that Dagny thought about the world. I sort of identified with Howard Roark because he was about creative integrity. He was about carving his own path, the same way that Dagny was, but from a different perspective, and that sort of worked for me. And if you've heard us speak before, we've talked about these things quite a bit. But as we were preparing for that first talk in Batumi, we somehow or another rediscovered We the Living. And we were talking about it, and we were arguing about it and debating it. And
like the rest of our marriage. Arguing, debating.
And what's interesting about We the Living in the context of this dramatic thing we've gone through over the last 2 to 3 years, lockdowns and all of these totalitarian, authoritarian dictates on how we lived our lives and you know, whether or not we would choose to get vaccinated and whether or not we were allowed to work, on and on and on. I'm starting to appreciate the importance of We the Living. How many have read We the Living? Okay, so not so many. There'll be spoilers today, but that's
How
okay.
many of you have seen the movie We the Living? Oh, okay. How many of you even knew that there was a movie, We the Living? So we're going to show a short clip from it, and then after we show this clip, we're going to talk about the movie and how it came to be. It's actually a pretty amazing story. So this film was made in 1942 in Italy at the height of Mussolini's power. And the directors and the producers were able to do this by convincing Mussolini and the rest of the regime that it was just anti-Soviet and anti-communist, and that it was pro-fascist. And the government was so leery of this film that they insisted on seeing the daily clips and monitoring everything that they did throughout the course of the production of the film. And the producers, well, let's just say they were selective in what they showed to the censors. So the Italian government didn't realize the extent of what this film actually said about anti-authoritarian and how anti-authoritarian it was and how it was against those regimes. So it premiered at the Venice Film Festival to huge, huge success, and it was immensely popular for 3 months until the government realized what the message actually was. And so at that point, they made them pull it from the theaters. They actually told them that they had to turn over the negatives of the film and that they were supposed to be destroyed. Luckily, the producer gave them a different film so that it wasn't actually destroyed, and it was found again in the 1960s by Rand's people, and then remade and shown in the 1980s. And it also, this version of it has been digitally remastered, and it's going to be released this year. But that 3 months was all that was needed for this film to spark a little bit of a revolution in Mussolini's government and country.
Yeah, what's fascinating about it is I think the government, despite their leeriness, didn't appreciate how dangerous this film was until it became so wildly popular, and to the point where it was released in 2 different films, because the original film was 4 hours long, which was just too much for people to sit through in one sitting. So one film, the first film was called We the Living, and the slogan on the streets of Rome at the time became We the Dead, in response to the fascist government. The second film was called Goodbye Kira, and it became
Goodbye Lira.
referring to the debasing of the Italian currency under the fascist regime. So it's a powerful reminder why a story can fundamentally change hearts and minds and undermine the most powerful governments in the world, and in some ways is new inspiration for us in what we do at Free the People.
Right, I mean, as many of you know, Free the People, we produce videos. I like to say that we're a video production company. And we truly believe in the power of a story to change people's minds rather than a lecture or a spreadsheet or a downward sloping demand curve. That when you reach people's hearts and minds, it's how you can get them to realize the dangers of government totalitarianism and how valuable freedom and liberty is, so that you can then actually you can be the living in your life.
So going back to March of 2020, I think that's when the event was in Batumi, right? It was like...
Right, it was right as the world was shutting down.
As I like to say, right before the world ended, we had all gathered in Batumi, Georgia, and it's so special to us because everything was normal back then, and we weren't afraid of each other, and we weren't told that being together was, in fact, a form of murder. You're going to kill somebody simply by being around somebody else. All of that weirdness wasn't there yet, and then suddenly something changed, and it changed our lives in a profound way, because for all of these years leading up to then, we had started giving these talks together and squabbling on stage and doing all the things we do. And that was now effectively illegal across the globe. We couldn't do that anymore. We also couldn't travel and do some of the business things that we wanted to do. So we had to rethink who we were and what we did.
Right, and so we fundamentally changed what we did at Free the People. We started focusing on the lockdowns of not just the U.S. government, but the governments across the globe. I mean, we had it bad in the United States, but I mean, in France, you actually had to get a paper from the government to be allowed to leave your home. And so I don't think it's that much of a stretch to talk about what we've gone through during the lockdowns and what they went through in We the Living. There was so much that were similar, and it was truly scary. But we did the best that we could, and so we changed our lives. We used to do a lot of international travel, but we started traveling within the United States because it's what we could do. Matt actually drove over 900 miles from Washington, D.C. to the state of Iowa to get a beer because his favorite brewery was open there, and it was a sign of his defiance that he drove that far to live his life, to be able to do what he wanted to do.
I don't know about in other places, but in the United States at that time, it was quite often illegal to cross state borders unless you were an approved class of person. I happened to be technically a member of the media, so I had papers to cross state lines in the freaking United States of America. And I just thought that was crazy, and when we first started thinking about it, we didn't know anything about epidemiology, and we didn't know anything about what this virus would do, but as an economist, I knew that shutting down the world would have dire consequences for people. And we started talking about that, not knowing much about where we were at the time, but very early on we started questioning the logic of lockdowns and centralizing all, not just authority, but knowledge in the top. And that knocked us off of our business plan because for a lot of people that was controversial. A lot of people were scared. A lot of people didn't know what to do. But we thought that somebody had to point out that regardless of your aspirations, and you may have all of these nicely stated good intentions, the reality is if you shut down the economy, people, particularly people at the margin, will start dying. They will not survive because they won't be able to eat. And that's why people hate economists, because we say really uncomfortable things like that. But it got to the point where we realized 2 weeks to flatten the curve had become this very authoritarian thing. There was something called the science. Do you remember this? The science is settled. Stop talking. Don't question the science. And it became like a religious thing. It became an article of faith, and if you're an apostate against this idea that we must just do what we are told, no matter the consequences, you became a pariah. Which brings us back to We the Living. And it just went black when I said that.
So this is you.
And this is a spoiler. Sorry, you guys have to read the novel, and we're gonna turn you on to it, but you still need to read it. This is Andre. Andre is the Communist Party guy that she meets in that short clip there where he's questioning her right to question the Communist Party. And he believes that communism is the honestly best way for people to thrive. He thinks that this is how you lift people up and people will thrive and people will be free to live their lives. And he is a party apparatchik. Somewhere along the way he realizes that that's a lie, that it's not true, all of these things that he was told. And here he is at a party meeting, outing himself, starting to destroy his career within the party. Comrades, brothers, listen to me, listen. You consecrated warriors of a new life. Are you sure we know what we are doing? No one can tell man what they must live for. No one can take that right, because there are things in men, in the best of us, which are above all states, above all collectives. Do you ask what things? Man's mind and his values. So he just got red-pilled, no pun intended. And at some point along the way, I became insufferable in our house because the more I got into it, I couldn't just think about economics and the logic of breaking supply chains and the devastation that would be caused, particularly people at the margins. I had to start learning epidemiology, which is not something that I had in my house plan. So we started talking to really important, smart people like Jay Bhattacharya and others through my podcast, and we started producing all of these things to the point where Terry just got really frustrated with me because I was so dark. I was so angry about this stuff, that all of this devastating things were happening, particularly to children.
Children and families and business owners, but there were glimmers of hope, right? Like you would find the people who initially went along with it because what else would you do? But then as the government cracked down more and more, people started questioning things. And we met this amazing business owner in Washington, D.C. His name is Eric Flannery. And the first year that we did our talks in Batumi, we did a session on everyday heroes. And had we known Eric then, we would have put him in that category of an everyday hero. He stood up to the government and bore some consequences of it. So we're going to show a short clip of the film that we have made about him, and then we'll talk about it again.
I'm Eric Flannery. I was opened up this bar with the help of my brothers about 10 years ago here in Washington, D.C. I'm a nuclear engineer. I was in the Navy for 7 years. I've worked in Silicon Valley. I know how to do things, marketing, sales, operations. I've worked in all those jobs before. I've learned plumbing and electrical work while I've been down here. I have a lot of options of work that I can do. That doesn't mean that I want to do any of those. I want to be down here running the bar. This was my life dream, to come down here and open this bar. I've been talking about opening up this bar since I was 21.
Beginning on January 15, 2022, certain establishments will be required to verify that their patrons, 12 years old and older, have received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine.
When the mayor decided to implement these mandates, I looked at him and I said, hey, that's just not the right thing. That's not the American way. There's not a reason why we should exclude anybody from this bar, because that's the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to welcome everybody into the bar. Everybody should be welcome. That should be true everywhere in America. What happened from that was, man, full force from the DC city government. Everybody, when they're 21, 22, is like, I want to open up a bar. I remember watching Cheers as a young man, and I really did, and I watched it. I mean, it just was a great experience in a show that I loved, and an idea that I loved, of just people where everybody knows your name, and people are happy, and it's a really good place. And I think that's what we've built here. My brother bought a house out here in Northeast Washington, D.C. and said, hey, Eric, I think we can finally open up a bar out here. And I said, where? He said, Northeast Washington, D.C. And I laughed at him on the phone. I was like, no way, we're coming to Northeast D.C. I'm not taking my life savings there. About 5 months later, probably, my dad passed away from cancer. I was 36 and said, either you're going to do this or you're not going to do it, but you got to quit telling people that you're going to open up a bar if you're not going to do it. My older brother lived in Montpellier, France for 10 years, and he went out there and just kept staying and found a reason. He ended up being a sous chef at a small restaurant out there. And when we started talking about, hey, we're going to open up this bar restaurant, what we really wanted to do was have good food. And both of us love hamburgers. It's a really nice neighborhood. It's a really nice feeling to have a community and the people around you. And I think that this place is a really big part of that.
Because the mandate, was a mandate in DC where restaurants and bars are required to check the vaccination status of anybody 18 and older. And we didn't want to do that, so we did it.
Since we've made a stand, some people were not very happy that we were allowed to reopen. And they have continually harassed us in the small ways that they can. They call the Department of Public Transportation to look at our patio license. They call the DDOT to look at our trash area. They've now filed an official protest against our liquor license. And I've been assured by them that there is nothing unusual about these actions. I just don't see it happening to anybody else. There were people who used to come into the bar who I know, and I know them well, I know their families, and I will look at them and say, hey, how are you? How's your day going? And they will look down at the ground, look at the sun, pretend like I don't even exist. I'm not quite sure why, but it doesn't feel very good when these are people that you've talked with and dealt with who pretend like you're not even there. The city's council and the mayor were derelict in their duties to take the actions that they saw necessary if there was truly an emergency. They have to do that. They had plenty of time to write a law, to pass it through the legislature and approve it via normal means. They did that with a vaccine mandate for the kids in school, and at the same time abused their power by implementing the vaccine check mandate and the mask mandate in bars via executive order. That's not how our government's supposed to work, and that's not how a representative democracy works.
Even the businesses that didn't stand up, Eric stood up to the tyranny, but the businesses, just because you went along and played along with the tyranny doesn't mean you're still in business. Here in Washington, D.C., there's still businesses boarded up. They never recovered from this, and they didn't even take the stand that Eric did.
The world is tough right now for bars in D.C. I think the world's tough for bars around the country. But we're going to keep on doing what we've been doing, serving people with a smile, treating people with the dignity and the respect that they deserve, and continuing with our proof of concept. Everybody is welcome.
Let's do it. So there's so much about Eric's story that fits into this conference that we're talking about today and talking about being the living. I mean, his dad was an admiral in the Navy. He graduated from Annapolis from the Naval Academy, became a nuclear engineer, but that wasn't his calling. That wasn't his passion. So he gave up all of that and followed his dream and opened up this great little divey bar in DC, which is luckily less than a mile from our house. And they truly do make some of the best burgers in the city. So if you're ever in DC, you should go to the Big Board. But when he decided to stand up to the government, the wrath of the bureaucrats was amazing. Nothing in the DC government works very well, but they were so efficient when they came after him. Within a day, they had taken away his liquor license. They had taken away his business license. They had written up multiple health violations. Meanwhile, the health department had not stepped foot into his establishment for 7 years prior to this, but then they came in and shut him down. And he just kept fighting and fighting, and we were fortunate in that we knew a guy, which are the most important words you can ever utter, and we connected him with a lawyer that has been helping him fight the DC government, and they're now taking it on to a federal case. Eric is actually suing the District of Columbia in federal court on constitutional grounds to make sure that governments can't do this in the future. But Eric alluded to this because he went against the government. His neighbors, his patrons, his regulars, they started to shun him. They wouldn't talk to him. But he is held strong and is holding on barely to his business, but he's still a happy warrior.
Yeah, when we first met Eric, that night that they had taken away his livelihood, and we introduced ourselves, he's like, I don't know what to do. I don't think this is about politics. I don't understand what's happening to me. And he was sort of nervous because we didn't pretend who, we didn't
We didn't
pretend.
hide who we were.
Yeah, and I wanted him to know who he might associate with. And at the time, he's like, I just hope this goes away. But as they have tried to destroy him again and again and again, he's started to read the same books that we read, and he's now one of us, but that's not the point. The point is, he has a dream that he's pursuing, and they just took it from him. This is, in my mind, no different than the seizing of Kira's father's business in the beginning of We the Living. It sounds different, but it's still wrapped in this language that, oh, we're just trying to keep people safe, so we're going to destroy the people that don't comply.
So now we've just changed our presentation because we realized we were running out of time.
Well, let me summarize this.
Okay.
When we were getting ready for this talk in Batumi 3 years ago, we were obsessing with what are the tools that objectivism can give you, that Ayn Rand's stories can give you, that will help you live a life that feels good, that has purpose, that leads to happiness. And even before the lockdowns, there was a crisis in particularly in young people. Like, where do I find purpose? Where do I find dignity? One of our favorite democratic socialists in the United States, Angela, what's her name? Not Angela, sorry, Angela. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. She says that her generation in the United States has never known true prosperity. And she objectively grew up in the richest county, in the richest country, at the richest time in the history of humankind. But she believes that that is true, and she talks a lot about dignity. And we thought that these tools that we were bringing to Batumi, the values that we've been talking about this whole time, purpose, integrity, work, honesty, all these things, leading all this hierarchy, leading all the way up to real trust and love in relationships, that these would be things that could turn on people that would never come to a conference like this. And fast forward 3 years when so much damage has been done. I assume you've seen this data, but teen suicide is through the roof. Schools were devastated. Young people were locked into their homes just at that point when they were feeling all of this anxiety.
I thought we were going to be more positive today.
That's your job. Well, so you could view this as a crisis.
Or you can view it as an
opportunity.
And so within We the Living, there's obviously a number of characters. There's Kira, who is so firm in her beliefs of freedom and liberty and against the state. And her cousin, Irina, believes it, but not quite as much. And so Irina is basically having this same conflict within herself that Matt is describing just now about what's happened today. And so she says,
this is not uplifting at all.
Well, we're going to get there. I get to end on a happy note.
Are you going to end it on a happy note?
I always do.
Okay. I've given up, and I'm not afraid. Only there's something I would like to understand. That bubble just popped into my quote. And I don't think anyone can explain it. There's your life. You begin it. Feel that it's something so precious and rare, so beautiful, that it's like a sacred treasure. Now it's over, and it doesn't make any difference to anyone. And it isn't that they are indifferent, it's just that they don't know. They don't know what it means, that treasure of mine, and there's something about it that they should understand. I don't understand it myself, but there's something that we should understand by all of us, that should be understood by all of us. Only what is it? What? And I found that quote, that's in the introduction to Ayn Rand's republication of We the Living in 1956, and she thought that question was the core of what We the Living was trying to answer. But it also happens to be the core of why we're here today and why there's an opportunity to help people to live a life that matters. And it's not a lecture, it's not something that we're going to tell them to do, but we're going to give them, hopefully, tools that will help them get there.
So, spoiler alert, if you haven't read We the Living, it doesn't really end well. Kira is struggling to escape, trying to get out of Russia, and she comes so close, and she can see the border, but she's been shot down by a guard, so she is dying. But she still looks back on her life and recognizes that, she was so firm in her beliefs that everything was worked out, even though her life was cut short. And so the book ends with a moment or an eternity. Did it matter? And remember, she's lying in the snow, bleeding, dying at this point. Life, undefeated, existed and could exist. She smiled her last smile to so much that had been possible. So she recognized the value of freedom and recognized how important it is to live your life, to be the person that you want to be. And I think it's weirdly, it's a beautiful ending to a story. So that gets us to, how do you want to live your life? Do you want to be the living? Or do you want to concede your life to the demands of the mob and shuffle through life with the zombie mob? Do you want to be this? Or do you want to live a life based on the values that we hold dear? A life filled with love and happiness and purpose, not dictated by the state. Do you want to be this?
Petit battement. And 1, 2, 3, a change. 1, 2, 3, a change. 1, 2, 3, a change. 1, 2, 3, a change.
So you choose. Do you want to be a zombie or do you want to be her?
How many of you guys know who that is?
It doesn't matter.
See, I told you they wouldn't know.
Well, that's why I didn't reference her. So the woman in that film is a woman named Lucille Ball, and she was an incredibly successful comic in the 50s and the 60s. She starred in a number of series, and she also was the first woman to run and own a major movie production studio. So thank you for your time. We have plenty of time left for questions. Do you have anything else you want to say, Matt? Do you want to be the closer?
No, you're the closer, baby.
All right. Thank you very much. Questions? Wow.
All right, I'm going to show you a clip instead then.
Oh, wait, here we go. But I'll go back to that.
Still seems to be working.
Thank you for the presentation, and I want to ask about how can we prepare for another systematic attack on freedoms, like one during lockdowns. Like some people are arguing for climate lockdowns or other ways of limiting freedom. So what can we do against those threats?
Yeah, I think the question is, what is the next crisis that will justify a suspension of individual rights for these radically authoritarian measures? And I think, it might be climate change. It honestly could be anything, right? Because the infrastructure is still there to do all of these things. And in Eric's individual case, it took the mayor of the District of Columbia almost 3 years to give up her emergency powers that was supposed to last 2 weeks. And in that time, she did whatever she wanted, basically. There was no rule of law or anything else. The President of the United States, just on Monday, finally eliminated the emergency orders in the United States on COVID, which is easily 2.5 years too long. In my mind, 3 years too long. I think we have to get at the core of what this conference is about. We have to make people comfortable with the idea that they don't owe their lives to some collective authority and some first claim on their lives. And I'll use a specific example and why I got so frustrated with the ongoing logic of the lockdowns. A real virus, a real danger, but the first thing that the governments did was lock us down. The second thing they did was socialize the vaccine in the United States, and I think this is true everywhere. The government developed it, the government owned it, the government purchased it, and then it decided who got to have it first. In the district,
In the district, it was fascinating. They came up with, the most vulnerable health-wise, and you would get it in the first tranche, and then they had another category for the second tier if you had lesser ailments, and then the third tier all the way down, which on the surface makes sense, except that there was there's a very big caveat in their decision-making, and it was, you could have, stage 4 cancer, a heart disease, and diabetes, so you would think you would be first in line. But if you lived in these certain areas of the city, these certain zip codes, they were considered to be wealthy neighborhoods, and so you weren't allowed to get it. You were knocked down to like the 4th or the 5th tier. So it was really based on wealth rather than on actual health discrepancies.
so I think this is, so many people fell in line. It became like a religious thing as far as I could tell. And part of it wasn't just a socialization of the production and distribution of vaccine. You were told originally that you should get vaccinated to protect yourself, but then it became you have a moral responsibility to get vaccinated to protect somebody else. So you took away the responsibility, you took away the risk assessment of different people. Young people who had virtually no risk of getting sick still had a moral responsibility to get vaccinated for somebody else. And the same logic was then applied to masks. You weren't masking for yourself, you were masking for somebody else. And I've only been blocked on Twitter once in my entire career because I'm usually not an asshole on Twitter the way that most people are. There's a comedian named Kathy Griffin. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she was spouting off about a decision to unmask very young children in schools in New York City. And she was a cancer survivor, and she was demanding that we continue forever to mask young people in schools.
To protect her.
To protect her. Now, I'm a stage 4 cancer survivor, and the thought that at the height of my cancer, when my immune system was completely shot, that I could demand that all of you stay home to protect me to go about my business, that there's some perversion there. There's some inversion of individual responsibility. So I think it gets at its core to a philosophical question about who is responsible for keeping you healthy. And I think it's you. I think you make those choices, and I think you make responsible choices, and I think that different people have different risk assessments, but if you take all that away and you replace it with a top-down system, that is the ultimate tyranny, and the new tyranny is going to be like that. It's not going to be the old tyranny of the Communist Party of the Bolshevik Revolution.
But to answer your question, after Matt's long, thoughtful rant about the tyranny of government, I think you just keep questioning. I mean, through this lockdown, everything, as he said, it became the science, and you weren't allowed to question the science. I mean, if you questioned the science, you were this horrible person that wanted to kill all the small children in the entire universe. But I think it's our moral duty and our moral responsibility to keep always questioning, but do it in a thoughtful way. I mean, don't throw flames on Twitter. That's not going to to change anyone's mind, but to make the moral argument about individual freedom and personal responsibility. I was just in Uruguay a couple weeks ago, and they didn't shut down for a day during this entire epidemic or pandemic or whatever you want to call it. They actually had a slogan that was freedom with responsibility, which meant that if you have to go out and do your job, but just be conscious of other people. And I think as long as we keep that as our message, freedom with responsibility, that we can make a difference and hopefully minimize some of the threats in the future. Tom. I say that with hesitancy.
I just have a question. How much of the use of the COVID case as a case study depends on the contingent facts of COVID itself? So I remember polio. I was vaccinated. My father was not, and he got it and was paralyzed for 2 years and survived. And I grew up knowing people who were in iron lungs. It's eradicated because of lockdowns and compulsory vaccination. And no one gets polio in advanced countries anymore. And smallpox also. My grandmother had both smallpox and survived. Many others did not. So if COVID were a lot more contagious, would you dial back your concern? Or a lot more deadly? Would you dial it back? I'm just wondering, as opposed to smoking, drinking, these are all things that affect only me and not you. But contagious disease might be different, and I just wonder how your case rests on how deadly and how contagious it is. That is to say, the extent of the externality. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, it does. And that ultimately is the question, and I've gotten that question before, and I think it comes down to two filters that I use whenever I'm deciding whether or not collective action, government action, using the power of the state is a good idea. And one question that would apply to March 2020 is, do they possibly know enough to know that lockdowns are a good idea? Because this was a very novel concept, and we really hadn't done it before. I don't know, did we lock down during polio?
Yes, and the Great Flu epidemic had massive lockdowns. Church services were banned, theaters were closed, and in addition to people not wanting to go to theaters.
Right.
But yes, in many cities, those public events were closed, and there was actually probably also not very successful mandatory masking in some parts of the U.S. and European countries.
So the second filter I would apply is, can they be trusted with that power? And I think on that front, hopefully we agree that they failed that test, because whatever might have been temporary and reasonable things in your mind never ended. But I think that my paradigm is always going to be based on personal responsibility. And if it is dangerous to go to a bar, don't go to a bar. And when you don't know enough that you can come up with one central plan on things, and I would argue that is always true, they don't know, that you have to discover through that process what makes sense for different people. Now, if this was the kind of deadly virus that would kill everybody, what difference does it make? But I know we disagree on this.
So I would add that the heavy-handedness of the government on this, where you couldn't question anything, where you couldn't say, is the mRNA vaccine the way to go? I think, to me, the way that they just eliminated any question or scientific inquiry that might look to the other side, I think that caused so much harm. And it's now causing people to question any other mandatory vaccine. So people aren't getting the polio vaccines, and they're not getting these things, and it's leading to a longer crisis. I'm also going to use an example of how government shutdowns for health then led to other shutdown. So in Washington, D.C., they had shut down all the restaurants and bars. You weren't allowed to go out at all. And they were going to lift those bans on January 15th, 2021, which was 5 days before the presidential election. And so, or not the election, the inauguration. So the presidential inauguration is a big deal in Washington, D.C. I mean, people come in, there's hundreds of thousands of people that show up. So the mayor was going to open the bars and restaurants right before the inauguration. Then January 6th happened, where the people stormed the U.S. Capitol, and she no longer wanted people to come to our city to celebrate the inauguration because she was afraid that it was going to lead to more violence. So she extended the restaurant shutdown until January 31st. So she used a power of the state that had been used for health reasons and then just extended it to meet her other agenda. And so that's, to me, the bigger danger of government taking these powers and then just extending them and expanding them into other areas of our lives.
So I'm not fine just using my voice. Okay. So there's so much we know now that those of us who were paying attention in 2020 knew then, but it's come out indisputably now about the way that the government was lying to us, abusing their power, covering up things like the lab leak and accepting Chinese numbers and data on this stuff and having parties while they're telling us lockdown. All this stuff's come out and confirmed what we knew about the severity of the virus, about the cost of lockdown. And yet, in my experience, nobody's come up to me who, basically stopped being my friend 3 years ago when I was disputing all of this and said, sorry, I was wrong. They're saying we didn't know at the time. Or they're just disputing it altogether and holding on to the narrative from 3 years ago. Like, do you have any confidence that people in general, I don't mean the people who were doing it, I mean the vast majority of people who just went along mindlessly with what they were told by the government and, worried when the government said to worry and didn't worry when they said it was fine again. Like, do you have any confidence that they'll ever learn, that we'll ever have a population that stands up to this kind of thing in the future?
Well, there has been some evidence of political backlash, but generally I would say I'm worried and skeptical that there will be the kind of accountability and learning on this. And I think it comes back to what Tom and I were talking about, is like, what is the alternative to this one-size-fits-all central planning approach to pandemic management? And it has to be like pro-science. It has to be open debate. It has to be the acknowledgement that we don't know nearly as much as we think we do. And the other thing, and this is what I'm particularly concerned about, is there absolutely has been a government-funded experiment in gain-of-function research that was part of a central plan to make sure that we would be safe from bioterrorism weapons. And in the process, it leaked out and created a pandemic. And that to me sounds really, really dangerous. And I think we need to expose that criminal behavior by our government as a first step to make sure that we don't do this again. But it gets back to, like, are you comfortable saying, I have health conditions that lead me to be anxious about being in public places, so I'm just not going to go out? Versus, I'm young and healthy, I'm willing to accept the risk, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do that. To me, the question is, do you own yourself? And are you a good enough person to be responsible to do that? Or should we treat you like farm animals and herd you and vaccinate you and do all the things that we did, one size fits all? That's why I think this conversation that we're having this weekend is so important, because we got to make that choice. And if it's not true that you don't get to decide, then they have a blank check on your life for whatever the next crisis is. Maybe it's climate change, maybe it's something else. I don't know. Hi.
Are there any other questions that don't deal with COVID? Because that's kind of off topic. Yes, thank you.
Mostly not COVID related. So I love the message of freedom with responsibility, and I love your advice, Terry, to question everything. I think that is a very properly scientific mindset. But how would you guys suggest encouraging that independent questioning mindset? Is that something that goes back to education? Is it something we can encourage in our social circles? What do you guys think about that?
I mean, I think it's all of the above, right? I mean, we can affect our people within our inner circles easiest, right? Because it's always better when you have a personal relationship with someone, and you can start with common ground and kind of push the envelope a little bit and you know, get people to start questioning things. But it's also, you know, one of the things I think that did come out of COVID that was a positive was a huge distrust of the government school system, at least in the United States. More and more families pulled their kids out and did homeschooling because they didn't like what was being forced on them, and I think that's a positive step in the future. So, you know, I think we do what we can, and we write articles, we make videos and tell stories about people's lives that were decimated by government actions, and also tell the positive stories too that are also so important to tell about how when people are given the opportunity to live free and responsibly, that's when the beautiful things happen in life.
I have the same question, but if we can focus it on parenting strategies. So how do we transfer that responsibility, sense of freedom and everything else, empathy, zombification to the next generation? Well, for myself, coincidentally.
You know about free-range parenting? Yes. So I think one of the, and we didn't talk about wokeness or any of that other stuff, but I think the obvious solution, and I'm not a parent, so prepare yourself for advice that I don't have to live by, but I think you let kids be free, and you let them make mistakes, and you let them learn by doing. I'm reminded of our favorite education intellectual. His name is Sugatra
Mitra.
Mitra.
He's from India, and if you've seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire, which is a great film, by the way, it's loosely based on his life, but he came to the realization that kids don't need teachers to learn, that they actually will figure things out for themselves. And he realized that all you needed to do was to put 10 kids in a room and give them computers and a question, and they would figure it out. They would figure out the math, they would figure out the science, they would teach themselves to read better, to learn foreign languages. But what he did discover was that kids need positive reinforcement. They need someone to come in and say, "You did a good job, Magnus." And so what he did was...
Which Magnus didn't get as a child.
Which explains a lot about him today. And so what he did was, I mean, he spent a lot of time in the UK, and he put together, he said, the largest group of English grandmothers who would Zoom in, back before Zoom was a thing, but they would, you know, go online and go into the classrooms in these little villages in India, and these kids would present what they did, and they would say, "Good job." And that was all the children needed to do to then go on and tackle the next problem. It's an amazing story. He actually won one of the TED Talk prizes. He won $100,000 for this idea, so that he was able to replicate this in other villages.
So we did one of the more positive things, and this, like, what we were trying to do when we were in Batumi was just think about positive, beautiful, problem-solving, be your best self kind of stuff. And lockdowns, as you can tell, knocked me off of that game. But one of the documentaries we made during that time was a story about 5 different moms in 5 different circumstances who decided to pull their children out of Zoom school, and for 2 reasons. They learned that it was just this torturous regimentation that was not providing kids with any sort of inspiration, let alone knowledge, and they adopted various forms of homeschooling, unschooling, and what Terry's describing would be more in the unschooling genre that allows children to find their passions and pursue those in a far less structured environment. I'm a victim of government schooling, which is why I'm the mess that I am today, but I sure wish that I would have been free to figure stuff out for myself.
Anyone? Nope. We have solved all the problems, or created so many more that they're afraid to ask us anything else. So thank you all very much. If you have not yet, out on our table, there's a QR code and you can scan it, enter your name and your email, and we will be raffling off a couple copies of this signed and personalized to you by the end of the conference, because I don't want to carry them home. Thank you all again.